We're so thrilled that he's here with us. So, Dr. Nedley, you're not new to New York. You were sharing that you were here before. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I was actually asked to come to New York in April of 2001 to put on a series of meetings in regards to mental health that I did not entitle. The person that invited me put all the brochures out, and the title of the series of meetings was Preparing for Stress and Depression. And I remember arguing with the individual in Greenwich Village right before it began, why did you name it this? This isn't what I told you to name it. And as I was asking him the question, he says, be quiet for a minute. Next to us, there were a couple of young girls who had the brochure with them and saying, what do they think is coming on New York City? Preparing for stress and depression. What is this about? And he said, see, I knew what I was doing in entitling this.
Well, I think anyone who you ask where they were on September 11 will be able to tell you the exact spot. I was sitting in Heathrow Airport. Other people will remember what they were doing, and so it was for a time such as this that that message came to the city.
Now, you also came back right after.
Yeah, it wasn't planned. I was supposed to be in Argentina, but afterwards, Dr. Anderson asked me back to Manhattan, and we put on the first public grief and depression recovery program here. We worked with the people who had suffered serious loss at Ground Zero, and then put on a series of meetings for them. It's still, if you look in the September 11 memorabilia sites, you'll see that whole series that's there. It's still mentioned as the first public grief and depression recovery program. And it was a real honor and a privilege to be able to minister to a city that was very hurting at that time.
Such a critical time.
Exactly.
For you to be here. Yes.
Well, thank you for coming to minister to us tonight, and also to share the importance of looking after and maximizing the brain potential, which is such an amazing gift.
Well, it's
So
my
the
privilege.
time is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, each one, for coming here tonight on this Optimize Your Brain series. Tonight, we are going to be talking about how to enhance your IQ. And we'll also be talking tomorrow night about how to enhance your emotional intelligence. And then Saturday night on nutrition in the brain, which has to do with all of those areas of IQ, EQ, and other areas. Well, fortunately, your intelligence can be enhanced. But first of all, what is your IQ? It's your capacity to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. That sounds pretty simple, but it requires a lot of different things. Not only do you have to learn it, what else do you have to do? Retain it. That means you have to have a memory. I've met some individuals that say, I just want to be able to think. I don't want to be able to memorize. In order to be able to think adequately, you do need to have a memory. Memory is an important part of IQ, but it's not the only part. We need to be able to apply that knowledge, which involves not only using our frontal lobe, that we'll talk about, but it also involves putting our thoughts into action or behavior. Well, it's often measured by an IQ test. The IQ test is an imperfect test to measure IQ, but it's still probably the best test that we have available. I didn't see how many of your hands went up. How many of you have actually taken an IQ test at some point in your life? Maybe a fourth of you have taken it. I know those that joined the military had to take it, and sometimes other jobs. Intelligence is related somewhat to academic performance, but not across the board. College graduates' first job after graduation has been found to be related to their IQ. So how good of job you get after college has a relationship in regards to your IQ. But as you'll find out tomorrow night, how far you advance in that job is no longer strictly related to your IQ. It's related to another form of intelligence called emotional intelligence. But let's talk about some of the advantages of higher intelligence tonight. One of the advantages is you're more efficient in studying. That means you don't necessarily have to study night and day to get a 4.0. You're more creative. In fact, studies have shown that unless you have an above average IQ, you won't be truly creative. We'll talk about true creativity here in a little bit. You're more logical if you have a high IQ. In addition, as a result of these things, you tend to be more persuasive. And this is why particularly those that have high IQs that are enemies of us, we try to do whatever we can often to subdue and silence them, because if they just get in front of a crowd of people, they sometimes can really cause them to be persuasive even in ways that are not necessarily best to be persuasive in. In addition, advantages of higher intelligence, you of course tend to have an increased influence if you have that. And I am just having, I don't know if we have a way of correcting the clicker that I have here tonight, but my clicker is having an issue. More likely to become wealthy, although not everyone with a high IQ will have this as one of their high priorities. So there are individuals with very high IQs that, because they do not prioritize wealth and they prioritize things that are probably of more importance than wealth, are not very wealthy. But in general, if you have all of those above bullet points there, if you have wealth as one of your priorities, it will most definitely happen. Well, there's another big advantage. This was a large study, 862 men and women, followed since childhood, started in 1922 and ended in 1986. But as you can see, it was published in 2005. I like these long, longitudinal studies. They can tell us a lot of information. The researchers found that up to the cutoff point of 163, participants' risk of dying during a given period decreased as their IQ increased. What does this mean? This means that IQ gave them a longevity advantage. In fact, those with a childhood IQ of 150 had a 44% lower risk of death than those with an IQ of 135. Now, what's the average IQ? Anyone? 100 is the average IQ. And every standard deviation is another 10 points. So 110 would put you almost in the upper third of the country. 120 would put you almost in the top 20 percentile of the country, 1 out of every 5. So 135 is a very high IQ, and 150 is even higher yet, and you can see the cutoff point is 163. That would be 99.9 percentile, very high. But even raising your IQ from 135 to 150 can be associated with a lower risk of death. Now, at the time that this study was published at Harvard, the researchers wondered why. Is this another factor that we need to look at in regards to longevity? We've always looked at other lifestyle factors, but IQ itself seems to emerge as a longevity factor. And it turns out one of the factors related to longevity we'll talk about here tonight. We'll hopefully talk about the other one. The other one had not yet surfaced as of 2005, but has just recently surfaced as to why IQ actually does have a longevity advantage. Well, let's deal with some myths about intelligence. One of the myths is genetics is all that matters. And that is a definite myth. One of the reasons why genetics seems to be the thing that matters is many individuals in our society today are raised in a rather uniform way. They go to the same schools that are accredited by the same accrediting bodies. They have the same curriculums. They are pretty much have the same diet, the same entertainment, watch the same movies, listen to the same news programs. And if everything is uniform, the one thing that's going to be different is what? Genetics is going to be different. And so genetics seems to be the factor that surfaces a lot in regards to intelligence. If your parents were highly intelligent, chances are you are as well. However, recent data shows that genetics is actually a minority player as far as your intelligence is concerned. There are other factors that are of greater importance than that. One of the other myths is there's nothing you can do about it after age 18. One of the reasons why that myth is perpetuated is because many people at the end of high school or entering into the military had to take an IQ test. And then after they went to college and they learned a lot of things, they took another IQ test at age 30, realizing in their own mind how much smarter they are than they were at age 18, and they take that IQ test and they find out it's exactly the same as it was at age 18. Now, what's the problem there? Now, first of all, IQ is not measuring how much you know. What is IQ measuring? It's your capacity to learn, retain, and apply new knowledge. And so, yes, that 30-year-old knows a lot more, but that IQ test is not measuring their knowledge base. It's measuring their capacity. And unfortunately, in many individuals, simply because they are living pretty close to the same lifestyle as they were at age 18 in many ways, their capacity has not really increased. And fortunately, it can increase significantly. In fact, sometimes very dramatically if we make some radical changes in our life that are very positive changes, as we will be talking about here. Now, another myth is that people that are highly intelligent are generally irritating to be around. One of the reasons why that myth is perpetuated is because about half of people with high IQ are irritating to be around. And the reason why they're irritating has nothing to do with their IQ, however. It has to do with their EQ. You can have a high IQ, but a low emotional intelligence, and you're not going to have good relationships. And it turns out people with high IQ sometimes also have a high EQ, and they can be very enjoyable people to be around, even though they have a high IQ. So it turns out you're actually no more or less likely to be fun to be around based on your IQ. It's really based on another form of intelligence. Another myth is that people that are highly intelligent lack common sense. Actually, Einstein perpetuated that myth right here in New York because he would frequently get lost on his way home from work. He would have to pause and ask for directions, and he'd be several streets off. The individuals would say, you know, that's Einstein, and he doesn't even know how to get home, and he's the one doing all of this stuff and, you know, helping us to create atomic bombs and all of these equations and everything. But in reality, it wasn't because Einstein was lacking in common sense. Studies actually show the opposite. The more highly intelligent you are, the more likely you are to have common sense. But he was so focused on what he was thinking on that he would just lose track of what was around him. And that high focus was of such a priority to him that finding his way home from work wasn't until after a long time he wasn't there, and then it became a priority for him. Now, another myth, you can't improve it, so why try? Actually, you can improve it significantly. And I'm just going to tell you a little snippet of a story of someone in our area. I live in two places, Ardmore, Oklahoma, and Weimar, California. But in Ardmore, Oklahoma, there's a nice, healthy vegetarian restaurant in town. And one individual who had barely made it through high school. This was the public high school system. And I don't know if you're aware of what public high school systems do today primarily, but you don't have to make very good grades in order to be advanced to the next grade the next year. Often you're advanced for social reasons, and the individual, you know, the school system feels sorry for you because you just don't seem to have it intellectually, and we don't want to hurt your self-esteem. And so you continue to be promoted year after year, and you graduate with really not learning much more than what a fifth grader knew back a generation or two ago. And this individual is one of those individuals. He had just been pushed from grade to grade. Now, fortunately, he did have a form of intelligence that helped him later on. He was a well-liked individual because he had some emotional intelligence. And he actually, as a result of going to this vegetarian restaurant in town and learning a new way of eating, he also became interested in reading the Bible. And after several weeks of studying, he actually decided that he was going to live according to the Bible. And the individual that was helping him study says, you know what, you're so interested in the Bible, you ought to go to a Bible school somewhere and learn how to teach the Bible to others. So he went to a school in Oregon. It was an accredited school, so there was some rigor to it. And I happened to know the individual that was leading that school. And the individual leading it, when I talked to him about halfway through the semester, said, poor Les, I don't think he's going to make it. Nice guy. Everybody likes him. But he's not able to really grasp the material. And I just feel so sorry for him because his heart's in the right place, but he just doesn't have it. And I talked to him a few weeks later, and he says, you know what? He's not making F's anymore. He's got it up to some D's. In fact, he's making a few C's. We're still working with him. We're going to see if he might actually be able to pull through. But because of our accreditation requirements, we're still not sure. Well, after that semester was over with, I got the word that Les had actually passed, and he wasn't the bottom of the class. And so he actually got a job. I went to Denver, Colorado, or I think it was Denver, somewhere in Colorado, and began to teach others how to study the Word of God. And about a year or two later, he went back to his home in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I happened to be eating at the restaurant there. And Les came up to me and he said, Dr. Nedley, he says, I really like what I'm doing, but what I'd really like to become is a doctor. And I must admit, I had a very similar response inside. I was trying to keep a straight face. But then I thought, you know what? This young man has improved in ways, and who am I to be a judge? I did tell him this. I said, you know what, Les, being a doctor is not for everybody. I did mention that. But I said, you know, it does require a lot of rigor and disciplined thinking, and it requires a mind that's bright, that's going to be able to retain material and to do well. And he says, Dr. Nedley, what can I do to make my brain as the best that it can be? And as I mentioned, he had EQ. One of the factors that you'll learn about emotional intelligence is, in that word emotion is the word motion. He had motivation. And so everything that I told him that day, and I came back the next day because I didn't have the time to complete it, but we went through a system of what he can do, much of what you're going to learn about tonight. And he kept on that system for a whole year, and then he finally actually went to the University of Oklahoma and started taking pre-med, and started taking classes like chemistry and biology. And, you know, that's a little different than learning Bible instruction sometimes. And he was getting C's to start out with, and then B's. And then pretty soon, he was up there in the A- range. And 2 years ago, he took his MCAT, and now he's in medical school today. His IQ went from 80 as a high school student, where the public high school teachers would have never guessed that he would have been able to be successful. And it's now up to about 120 in the top 1 out of 5. But with his high motivation level, he was able to achieve that. So your IQ can improve significantly, especially in certain cases. Well, let's take a look at some of the factors involved in IQ. One of them is the temporal lobe. We were utilizing our temporal lobe when we were listening to that music. That's one of the reasons why music and memory tend to go together as well. The temporal lobe is where our memory is centered. The occipital lobe is our spatial orientation, how good of a natural architect you are and being able to envision things from different angles, etc., has a lot to do with your occipital lobe. Your parietal lobe is where mathematics is centered. It's where your vocabulary is centered. Language comprehension is the parietal lobe, as well as other functions. Cerebellum is your coordination center. When teams get together to compete, what they're actually demonstrating, they don't realize they're demonstrating this, is which team has the most corporately functioning cerebellum at the time of the event. And then the area of the brain that has a lot to do with both IQ as well as EQ is the frontal lobe of the brain. And the frontal lobe is really what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. As you can see, other animals do have brains. The cat has a brain. I didn't realize how small it was till I dissected a cat in high school biology. But what I didn't realize then was only 3.5% of a cat brain is in the frontal lobe. Not much morality in a cat. If you've ever seen a cat torture its victims to death and enjoy the process, the frontal lobe has a lot to do with morality as well. Dogs have a little more frontal lobe. About 7% of a dog's brain is in the frontal lobe. They won't hesitate to murder if they have to, but they do it mercifully. They don't enjoy torturing other creatures. And they do have the ability to analyze above where a cat is at. Chimpanzees have the most of any other animal species, 17%. But what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom is our frontal lobe size. 33 up to 38% of the human brain is in the frontal lobe. And this is what allows us to accomplish advanced planning and thinking, to choose our own destiny, to have foresight, and to have actually even empathy, which is a frontal lobe function. Now, Guyton's textbook of physiology stated a few years ago, I imagine it still does, I haven't looked at the most recent edition, but a few years ago it said scientific studies show the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and also the will. And so if we want to follow the decline of morality among a human population, we're going to have to focus in on the frontal lobe of the brain. And this is an area that should also be of particular concern in regards to spiritual or religious leaders. You know, one of the reasons why in a worship service you don't see cats and dogs flocking to that service is because they don't have the frontal lobe capacity for that. Now, some of you might say, well, you know, I'm an agnostic or an atheist, you know, I'm really not, utilizing my frontal lobe per se. But in reality, even an atheist or an agnostic is, because atheists and agnostics still worship. The difference is what they're worshiping or who they're worshiping, but they can be very worshipful creatures because of that frontal lobe. And so really every intact human being does have a frontal lobe, and of course that frontal lobe can grow significantly in regards to capacity and in regards to function. There are character strengths that result from enhanced frontal lobe function that go beyond what we've just talked about here today in regards to intelligence. A little bit more about creativity, sometimes called ingenuity. The two essential components are originality and adaptive, making a positive contribution to the life of others. Now, studies show the more you daydream, the less creative you are. And the less you daydream, the more creative you are. Creativity has to be truly creative, it has to be completely original. Now, people with lower IQs can copy very well, and they can still function very well in life by copying well, but to be completely original and adaptive, making a positive contribution to others, it requires a frontal lobe that is functioning above, significantly actually, above average. An additional character strength that results from enhanced frontal lobe is interest. The frontal lobe is what helps you to have interest in things. And you know, it's fun to interact with someone who is intrigued by everything. And one of the reasons why, when the frontal lobe is functioning very well, the EQ part tends to also go up. The book Character, Strengths, and Virtues states, if curiosity can be cultivated, no one need ever search for interesting experiences. One will simply have them. And if this room were to empty out completely, and you would have to be confined to this room for hours on end, if you had an intact frontal lobe, you would be able to investigate something in this room that would be highly interesting to you. And you would be able to discover things. And you would actually still be able to have a sense of enjoyment, even though there's nobody here, etc., if your frontal lobe is functioning well. In addition, judgment is part of the frontal lobe. This is where, of course, everyone that is a good judge has to have a good functioning frontal lobe, but judgment sometimes is called critical thinking or rationality. And when this is working well, it feels good. It leads to good decisions and also leads to a coherent view of the world. Love of learning is part of the frontal lobe function. Wisdom is a major part of the frontal lobe. What is wisdom? It's the comprehension of what is true or right coupled with optimum judgment as to action. Empathy is a frontal lobe function, or kindness. And some individuals, in fact, a few years ago, I remember reading an article from a psychology journal where a psychologist was taking the position that empathy is impossible in human beings. That actually is true in certain situations. In fact, sometimes we will, there's kind of a cliche that we often say, and that is, there's no way you can understand what this person is going through unless you've been in their shoes. That is really denying the effects of empathy, or the fact that empathy exists. Empathy actually does exist in people with good functioning frontal lobes. In other words, even though you have not gone through that yourself, if you have a good functioning frontal lobe, you will be able to feel the exact emotional feelings that someone else is feeling by hearing their story, even though you haven't gone through that yourself. And that is actually a very positive character trait. That allows you to be able to identify with individuals, to be able to sympathize with them and help them and have a motivation to be a loving creature, which is really also part of the frontal lobe. And then social intelligence is part of it. Appropriate social behavior is a major part of what the frontal lobe does. Well, this research from New York underscores why we need more presentations like this today. According to the results of a study that followed thousands of students throughout their college careers, the higher education system, regional accreditation, is effectively broken, according to this research. Now, regional accreditation is the highest form of accreditation that a college can get. It's actually above what's called national accreditation. And this study looked at 22 institutions of higher learning, many of them Ivy League schools right along this coast. The results show that many students are leaving college with degrees, but little to no improvement in critical thinking or complex reasoning skills. This, of course, is sad analysis. New York University sociologist Richard Arum, lead author of the study, reports that after following 2,322 typically aged college students from 2005 to 2009, he found that a whopping 45% showed no improvement in higher reasoning and critical thinking skills after 2 years. So they measured them right after they graduated from high school. They measured them 2 years later in very famous institutions that are supposed to be able to improve your IQ, and actually found that as far as the critical thinking was concerned, it had not improved the slightest. Moreover, 36% managed to go 4 years and obtain a bachelor's degree with no improvement whatsoever. The study also found that while more selective schools had higher overall success, all 24 universities involved had small groups of presumably self-motivated kids who were learning a lot among a majority who were just getting by. And so fortunately, in some of these institutions, despite the system around them and despite the peers, some of them are actually learning a lot. The most successful students tended to work on their own rather than studying or working in groups. I found that interesting because sometimes the peer pressure at colleges and universities, some of the peer pressure is the partying atmosphere, but that's a minority at many of these Ivy League schools. But what often is the peer pressure group is to just get by, so to speak. And so the popular teachers are the ones that you don't have to study very hard and you can still get a good grade, et cetera. And so and then the social aspect is really the high priority and not really learning. While one aspect of this could have to do with self-motivation or simply study habits, another reason that surfaces is that these students don't like to group up because the majority of those groups are kids from the 45% who still haven't grasped critical thinking. And so it's not really efficient for them to study with that particular group. Many graduates, yes, people who graduated, had trouble sifting fact from fiction. This is pretty alarming. In addition, they had trouble addressing subjects objectively. In addition, they had trouble reconciling and analyzing conflicting reports of a single event. And they had trouble making decisions and arguments based on fact and logic without being affected by appeals to emotion or political spin. These are graduates from the most highly accredited universities in our nation. And in reality, as I look at the things that they were having trouble with, this is what we call critical thinking, which really isn't necessarily all that critical. I think these are things that we would tend to ask from functional citizens, whether they have a degree in art, history, biochemistry, or nothing at all. And unfortunately, they couldn't be performed by a large percentage of college graduates from prestigious universities. If you want to learn more about this, it comes from these studies and others come from a very expensive book because it has a lot of research in it called Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses. And it tells us about the problems that our nation is having as far as frontal lobe development. One of the reasons why we're suffering economically in this country is because creativity is an all-time low. You know, one of the things that's not being talked about, I'll just mention it. You know, we have a lot of this stuff that is involved in class warfare in our society today, and trying to be able to counteract the effects of poverty, etc. But what is often not said is we could solve our economic problems very easily when you recognize that the top 1% pay 50% of the taxes, particularly when you add some of their employees on it, it's even more than that. If we could get the top 1% to expand to 2%, in other words, those in the 99%, just get about 1% of them to move up to the creativity of the other top 1%, and everything is paid for. But if our frontal lobes are suppressed, if our creativity is down, we're not going to be able to get ourselves out of this economically by inventing more things that other people want to have that can make their lives more useful. There are effects of compromised frontal lobes. Impairment of moral principle, we talked about that. Social impairment. Your love for family is actually a frontal lobe phenomenon. If you lose that natural love for family, it's often due to a frontal lobe problem. Lack of foresight. Speaking of foresight, do you know how long it takes the frontal lobe to be fully developed in human beings? Structurally, the development takes 30 years to be completed. And so even though your high school student, age 18, has reached their adult size and weight, you need to recognize there's still hope for that individual. And even the 22-year-old that graduated from college, there's still hope. Structurally, that frontal lobe is not completed as far as its development is concerned. And if there's certain lifestyle habits that they encompass as a result of attending here or learning about it somewhere else, it can actually improve that much longer. And you can follow your child's frontal lobe development by how far they're planning in the future. And so that's a very good indication of how well that frontal lobe is functioning in regards to future plans and how far they are looking in the future. Abstract reasoning is impaired when the frontal lobe is compromised. Our ability to interpret proverbs is down. Even our ability to do calculus and higher forms of math goes down. In addition, loss of empathy that we also mentioned. But when the frontal lobe is also compromised, there will be a lack of restraint. And so boasting, hostility, emotional turmoil, etc., loss of temper is much more common in those who have a compromised frontal lobe. Well, research in the last 20 years has established that one of the main characteristics of virtually all depressed individuals, no matter what the underlying cause, is a significant decrease in the frontal lobe's blood flow and activity. This is a scan of an individual with depression. At the top of that depressed individual's brain is the frontal lobe there. And this is the same brain now that's recovered from depression. Notice the entire brain is functioning better, but the biggest before and after difference in activity is the frontal lobe of the brain. So one of the reasons why depression has become an epidemic is due to the frontal lobe. In fact, that's how I first began to get involved in frontal lobe enhancement, was because of my research in depression in treating those with treatment-resistant depression. Drevitz presents compelling evidence that frontal lobe problems are the cause and the effects are the depressive symptoms. And so even when the dog's frontal lobe is suppressed, that dog can get depressed as well. But in reality, if we want to turn this whole thing around, we're going to have to enhance the frontal lobe. There are drugs that impair the frontal lobe. Illicit drugs do it. Whether it's cocaine, marijuana, amphetamines, narcotics, they all suppress the frontal lobe of the brain. Some prescription drugs also suppress the frontal lobe of the brain, and that's why we always have to weigh the benefits versus the risks of taking these prescription drugs. Some of those drugs that do it are the benzodiazepines. They can make you feel good anxiety-wise, but they're going to suppress the frontal lobe and end up causing relationship issues and other issues long term. One of the reasons why we need to think of other ways besides benzos to help out with anxiety and particularly depression. There are legal drugs that also impair the frontal lobe of the brain. Alcohol affects the frontal lobe of the brain first before it affects any other portion of the brain. Now, if you were to drive at the legal limit of alcohol intoxication in the state of New York, and a policeman were to pull you over, would you be able to walk a straight line?
Yes.
You actually could. In fact, if you were skilled at doing so, you know, the most difficult physical feat to accomplish in sports, they say, is hitting a 85-mile-an-hour curveball out of a baseball park. It's just a small ball. It's going 85 miles an hour from less than 60 feet away by the time it's released, and you're just trying to hit it with a bat and hit it square out of the park. And studies show if you have the legal limit of alcohol intoxication on board, you will still be able to hit that curveball out of the baseball park. That's how well your cerebellum is functioning. But why is it then that you're 10 times as likely to get into an automobile accident?
You're more relaxed.
It's not due to the relaxation. It's due to impaired judgment. And that's what Princess Di's driver had. He was walking straight lines. He was conversing normally. Nobody recognized he was drunk, but he had attempted to negotiate a turn in a tunnel at a speed that was impossible to negotiate, even under the best of coordinated circumstances. That wreck has been well analyzed. The best race car driver in the world would never have been able to successfully negotiate that turn at that speed. And thus he lost his life. Others lost their life as well. Now, the next day, had he lived and not had that accident, would he have been able to drive an automobile successfully? He would have been able to. But let me ask you this. Does it take critical abstract thinking to drive an automobile? The answer to that is no. If it was yes, we'd never allow 16-year-olds to do it. The reason, but having said that, as far as critical abstract thinking is concerned, it takes 2 weeks for the brain to fully recover from alcohol. The FAA is looking at that, for instance, because it does take abstract thinking, particularly if your plane is limping and you've got a lost engine and you've got lost instruments and things like that to be able to land it in clouds. You've got to have a well-functioning frontal lobe of the brain. And, of course, their requirements are much stricter than it is in driving an automobile for that reason, but they're looking at even extending those requirements because of the research in regards to 2 weeks for the brain to fully recover. One of the reasons why it's best to abstain from alcohol. Nicotine has a more subtle effect on the frontal lobe of the brain, but it also impairs it. But this comes as a surprise to many. The most commonly consumed drug in America also impairs the frontal lobe of the brain. What's the most commonly consumed drug? Caffeine. It does end in INE because it is a drug, and it blocks the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe of the brain. Pavlov studied this out. Typists type a little bit faster under the influence of caffeine, but they make 10 times as many errors. And recently, a study showed that if you have caffeine on board, you're actually more likely to gossip than if you don't have caffeine on board. Now, the definition of gossip that they used in the study was sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. So if you're sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem, part of the solution to the problem, it qualifies as gossip. And if you have caffeine on board, you're more likely to do that. And when you're blocking the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe of the brain, it actually can have an effect in no longer having the appropriate brake on your tongue, so to speak, or on human behavior. And caffeine, most people, in fact, despite the overwhelming evidence in regards to caffeine and what it does to anxiety, etc., still many people conclude that they need to consume it because they think it's necessary in their case. This was actually studied recently at Bristol University. Most people drink it not only because they like the taste, that's often what's mentioned, but in reality they feel that they need to be stimulated. Without it, they would be a zombie. Caffeine addiction is such a downer that regular coffee drinkers actually get no real pick-me-up from their morning habit. What? You might say, Bristol University researchers found that caffeine beverage drinkers develop a tolerance to both the anxiety-producing and the stimulating effects of caffeine, meaning that it only brings them back to baseline levels of alertness, not above them. Well, this was a very well-designed, placebo-controlled trial, 379 adults. Although frequent consumers feel alerted by caffeine, especially by their morning tea, coffee, or other caffeine-containing drink, evidence indicates that this is actually merely the reversal of the fatiguing effects of acute caffeine withdrawal, wrote Peter Rogers of Bristol's Department of Experimental Psychology. Measurements showed that the caffeine users' post-caffeine levels of alertness were actually no higher than the non-caffeine consumers who received the placebo, suggesting caffeine only brings coffee drinkers back up to, quotes, normal. So what is this research telling us? In other words, all the reported benefits of caffeine are present virtually all day, only in those who don't consume it. So if you really want to have that stimulation, without the downers and without the need for it in the morning, quit it. You'll have headaches for 2 or 3 days. After 2 weeks, it'll be your acetylcholine production will go back up to the way it used to be before caffeine, and you'll actually have more energy throughout the day without it than with it, and your frontal lobe will function better. Interestingly, in the National Football League, NFL coaches are now telling their quarterback to consume no caffeine. It turns out, the interesting thing about that as well is the lineman coaches are telling the linemen to load up with caffeine to try to get that quarterback. So it seems unfair. The lineman loading up with caffeine and the quarterback told to consume no caffeine. Now, why is that the case? It turns out there's only one player on an NFL football field that requires an intact frontal lobe. And that is the one that has to analyze all of this information coming in and make a wise decision. And it turns out it's much better decision if he doesn't have caffeine on board than if he does. And if that's true for an NFL quarterback, what about in regards to you when there's difficult decisions and there's a lot of information and there may be something, someone has said something that makes you upset and you don't have that break on your tongue, so to speak. By the way, I think the lineman coaches will pick up on this. All of those false starts in the NFL, they're virtually all due to over-caffeine. Nothing has happened at all, and the person just swears that the other person on the line has moved, and they haven't moved at all. You just drank too much caffeine, bud. Get off of that stuff. But anyways, Paul Laurenti recently took a look at this. He calls caffeine the silent killer of emotional intelligence. And he's from Wake Forest University in Carolina, and recently a skeptical news reporter took a look at this. And I'll see if we can get this on your video there. All right, we're not getting sound. What is, there we go.
This was my brain before caffeine. This was after. The difference was remarkable.
It's like a 40% drop in the...
What he would say is in the circulation to the brain. And she is wondering about that much of a drop with just 1 cup of coffee. She's amazed at that. And you can, if you're interested in that, we might be able to have you see that clip later, the entire clip. Well, what does the frontal lobe desire for optimal function? Carbohydrates are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function. What foods have carbohydrates in them naturally? Fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. And study after study, it's showing the superiority as far as thought process and also in regards to intelligence. Now, you'd think if carbs were good for the brain, then sugar should be very good for the brain. But actually, the opposite occurs in regards to refined sugar. Large amounts of sugar in the diet have been demonstrated to impair frontal lobe function in school-age children and adults. This makes about a grade letter difference in most subjects. If it's a subject that really deals with the frontal lobe, it'll make much more than a grade letter difference. Now, why is this the case? When we eat a candy bar, our pancreas thinks we've eaten a large amount of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables, so it cranks out a huge amount of insulin, and within 20 minutes the blood sugar is lower than it was before we ate the sugary substance. And once we experience hypoglycemia, even though we might snack again to get it back up there, it can take 4 hours for the frontal lobe to fully recover from that. The memory can still work. The temporal lobe is doing fine, but the frontal lobe, in regards to the analysis, putting it in the appropriate subsets, being able to get it out, is no longer working as well. Another factor that we should mention is arachidonic acid. It decreases the synthesis and storage of acetylcholine, which is also an important neurotransmitter in regards to brain function. And arachidonic acid is present primarily in flesh foods, and one of the reasons why meat does not come out on top. This study done by the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health took a look at a largest study of its kind, over 4,000 kids. You can see their ages there on the screen, and it was controlled for known factors that can affect IQ. That this is instructional in itself in regards to these known factors: maternal education, maternal social class, maternal age, whether they live in council housing, life events, anything going wrong, the home environment, with the amount of books and use of television, and so on. And what they found is the 20% with the highest processed diet, higher in fats and sugars, had a 5-point lower IQ compared with the 20% who ate a more health-conscious diet with more fruits, vegetables, salad, pasta, and rice. Now, 5 points is a half a standard deviation. That's a pretty large difference. But in reality, by coming to Saturday night's presentation, where we'll deal with a lot more intricacies in regards to nutrition in the brain, we can raise it a lot more than those 5 points. That's just taking a look at the 20 percentile. If you get up into the top 1 or 2 percentile of eating, which any of us can do if we choose to do so once we're educated, we can have that IQ raise up even more. Interestingly, there was also an opposite study done on regards to what your IQ was at age 10 and what type of diet you would be on at age 30. What they found, this was a study from the UK, was children with high IQs are more likely to become vegetarians when they grow up. A study of more than 8,000 men and women, age 30, whose IQs have been measured when they were 10, showed that the higher the IQ at age 10, the greater the odds of becoming a vegetarian. In fact, every 15-point rise in IQ scores in the study, the likelihood of being a vegetarian rose by 38%. And this was also controlled for factors that affect a diet and lifestyle, even after adjusting to with social class and education, the link was still consistent. Now, the study's authors were wondering about this association. And it really isn't all that complex, and they finally got it in the conclusion after they wondered about it. Why is this the case? What is the definition of IQ? It goes back to that definition. The definition of IQ is to do what? To learn, retain, and apply knowledge. And so if you have a high IQ at age 10, you're more likely to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. You're more likely to discover knowledge in school and other places that shows the positive effects of a good lifestyle in regards to nutrition, and you're actually more likely to become a plant-based eater as a result. So that's one of the reasons why IQ is connected to longevity. If you have a high IQ, you're more likely to learn, retain, and apply knowledge that's going to affect your longevity and affect your quality of life in a positive way. So that's one of the 2 reasons why it is linked. IQ is linked to longevity. Physical exercise also plays an important role in regards to mental health. And aerobic exercise is very helpful, but there's also a type of exercise that's underemphasized that also is very helpful. And if I would like to have someone that help me with the going forward on that screen there, that might be able to help, as this clicker is almost dead. Working with one's hands in a real-world 3D environment is imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development, said the report's author, Dr. Eric Sigmund. With woodwork, metalwork, craft, music, or car mechanic classes dropped by many schools and children wanting to play computer games at home, the Western world is becoming a what? Software instead of a screwdriver society. Research is showing that increasing time spent in the virtual world of computers is displacing hands-on play and hands-on learning. And as a result, our engineering programs, our dental school programs, many of them are lamenting the fact that individuals are not able to think in 3D. 3D learning allows young people to experience how the world works in practice, to gain an understanding of materials and processes, and to make informed judgments about abstract concepts. In addition, when we work with our hands, there's circulation that goes to the posterior part of the frontal lobe. That's the back part of the frontal lobe. And so studies have shown just working with your hands repetitively, like washing the dishes or doing gardening, and doing that for more than 20 minutes a day will actually improve the circulation of the frontal lobe of the brain. And so mental workers would take note of this. If you really want to improve your mental capacity, you want to dedicate some time to working with your hands, not on a computer screen, but in a 3D type of format. And that will significantly produce benefit. Well, there's a couple of other factors, if I could have your help again, advancing the slides that I wanted to go through, and then we'll leave it open for questions. There have been over 3,000 studies done on the effect of entertainment television in the mind. Over 300 books have been written on the subject. And it turns out that entertainment television is defined by its rapid scene of reference change. The average scene of reference changes every 3 seconds, and if you watch your favorite television program, even though it might have good content, if it's entertainment and having that rapid scene of reference change, within 3 minutes you will be in alpha wave rhythm, no longer in beta wave rhythm on an EEG, and you will no longer be critically analyzing the information that's coming in. Your frontal lobe goes dormant. It's kind of a hypnotic trance that you're in. Your memory is still working. Your emotions are working, but it does cause a suppression in the frontal lobe in 17 different ways. And it's one of the reasons why entertainment television is one of the factors that has caused a significant decline in our IQ today, in our society. Entertainment television is shown to increase daydreaming, decreases creative ingenuity. It decreases in interest in reading. It decreases in interest in learning. It reduces discernment between what is right and what is not so right. It's also addictive. Anything that suppresses the frontal lobe of the brain will have an addictive potential. If you want to know whether a drug is addictive or not, find out if it suppresses the frontal lobe. If it is, if it does that, you know it's going to be addictive. And the same is true with entertainment television. It's actually been shown if you stop it abruptly, you'll tend to get headaches and insomnia and some of those type of withdrawal symptoms. It reduces sensitivity. It actually increases violence. This is one of the things that kind of perturbs me. Our media and our nation has been caught in this warfare of whether to have gun control or not gun control to spare violence in the future. No matter what side of that issue you're on, it's very clear that it will make a difference at most at about 5% of murders. Now that may be important enough to argue about it a lot, but there is something that has clearly been shown to increase violent crime by double, twofold, and it's watching entertainment Hollywood movies. Brandon Centerwall clearly demonstrated this. Washington State, the AMA knows about it. In fact, pediatric sites around the nation are now putting no TV signs instead of no smoking signs in their waiting rooms, et cetera, because of the adverse effects on emotional health, mental health, et cetera. But yet nobody is talking about that. That's off limits, even though it can make at least a 50% difference, if not more than that. And this is something that really our nation needs to be more educated on, and those 3,000 studies need to be put into application. This study showed the more TV adolescents watch, the more likely they are to develop attention and learning problems and to do poorly in school in the long run. The amount of TV kids watched when they were 14 was positively linked with having attention problems later, not doing homework, being bored at school, not finishing high school, and hating school, the researchers found. 14-year-olds who added one more daily hour of TV doubled their risk of academic failure at age 16. Just one more hour, doubling their risk of academic failure. And now we know, although this study was 2007, we now know that it not only takes away precious time for family, achievement, and spiritual pursuits, but other types of rapid scene of reference entertainment on a screen can have the same effect, whether it's video games or whether it's MTV and those type of things. They can cause a strong suppressant effect. And so these studies focusing on entertainment screen time are showing a decline in the brain. Well, tomorrow I'm going to be talking more about two other major factors that affect IQ. Then we'll go into EQ. We haven't reached the culmination of it. Actually, there's three other major factors that we haven't had time to get to tonight that are powerfully important. So you won't want to miss that. And if you put these principles into practice, not only will your own IQ go up, but I can guarantee you your relational issues, because it will also positively affect EQ, will also improve. And I would encourage you to take note of what the psalmist, or it wasn't the psalmist, it was the writer of the book of Proverbs, who was a very high IQ individual and also a very rich individual. He said, wisdom is greater than rubies. And he had more rubies than anyone else has ever had, as far as you look at the amount of money he had to the global monetary supply, and he would make Bill Gates seem like a poor individual. But he said that there's something far greater than all the money in the world, and that is wisdom. And then he went farther and he said, no matter what it is that you might desire, there's something that actually should be more desired, and that is wisdom. And so we cannot underemphasize the importance of wisdom. And by coming here to these series of meetings, you have all walked into the largest room in the world, and that is the room for improvement. And so I encourage you to review your own life, see what you can do to change, even though it may seem like a sacrifice at first. Anything that seems like a sacrifice that we do that is better for us is not really a sacrifice in the long run. It may seem like that, but it's one that's going only to enhance your life and also to enhance the life of others. Thank you very much.
A lot of
Well,
information.
That has been a whole truckload of information, facts, and challenges.
Yes.
Because on a physiological basis, you have challenged us to do something about something that we can do something about. You know, the changes in the lifestyle. Somebody wrote recently, and I was so impressed, if we are bored, we have only ourselves to blame.
That's right.
So thank you for highlighting that, for bringing so many factors of our day-to-day living, whether we're drinking, whether we're eating, whatever we're doing, those things that we take for granted can make such a big difference. Thank you for emphasizing
And
that.
I'm sure that after listening to you, Dr. Nedley, a lot of people might have questions.
All right.
You know, they may be
Sure.
thinking about some of the important things that you talked about tonight. And we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So we're going to take some live questions in the next few minutes from our audience here. If you have some questions, just raise your hand up high, and we will get some of you. We're not going to be able to answer all the questions, but we'll get some of you. And we're also streaming this live, as you know. So if you're watching us at home, you can go to our website. Of course, you're already there if you're seeing us, www.choosefulllife.org. And go there, make sure you click on the make a question, make a comment window, and you can send us a live question right now. We'll try to get some questions in place here as much as we can. We have a few minutes left for Dr. Nedley to answer. And then tomorrow, if you're okay, Dr. Nedley, we'll have you answer some of the questions people have online that we may not get a hold of tonight. And we just go to the website, and he may be able to answer some of your questions if we don't get to it tonight, okay? And so shall we get started? I don't know if We have our first person here that has a question. Just say your name,
My name is Andrea Hicks.
and then you can ask your question, Andrea.
My question is in regards to creativity. I'm a creative spirit. I like getting my mind going. What are some things that you can suggest to increase your creativity part of your mind?
Well, the things that we mentioned already are crucial factors on that. But in addition to that, studying the lives and thought processes of creative people who have come before us is a great way to go. And creativity is a lot about thinking, but it's also about persistence in thinking. You know, the inventor of the light bulb had to try several thousand filaments before he found the one that actually created the electricity we're all, and the light that we're all enjoying today. And he mentioned that it does require some inspiration, but it also requires 99% perspiration. So there's persistence in thinking along these lines. One of the things I'll just tell you I do is if I'm in a grocery line and having to wait a while, I'll have something that I want to think about written on a 3x5 card. So instead of just having my mind wander, keep it active in regards to things that will actually enhance the brain, and that's a great way to improve your creativity.
And do you suggest writing ideas down while you're...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, writing those ideas down so that you remember them and can refer back to them is a great way.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
And exercise can be such a stimulating component to thought processes and creativity.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, you mentioned exercise. You know, we have a wonderful program for the community on that called Adventist Step for Life and Let's Move. So people that are involved here in New York in Let's Move, we have 1,000 people that were here last year. They were helping their IQ, and they're from the low, from what you're saying.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
People that have high IQs, are they least likely to develop Alzheimer's disease?
Actually, they are less likely to develop it. Studies have shown in regards to academic performance, there is an advantage in regards to IQ. So it can be a protective against Alzheimer's, but it's not a complete protection. There are individuals with very high IQ who have also developed Alzheimer's disease. And one of the researchers that has researched a lot on this on Alzheimer's has stated that once we're 80 or 85, if we have a very high IQ to begin with and we lose half of the function of our brain, we'll still be higher than what the average individual is, and the people won't recognize that we've lost half of our brain already. And so that can be one of the advantages of developing that high IQ earlier in life.
Okay.
Thank you for your question.
Which one of your books have most of your lectures in that you're going to do tonight, tomorrow night, and Saturday night?
Probably the last book called The Lost Art of Thinking would have all three of those.
Thank you. And we have several guests with us tonight that got a voucher for The Lost Art of Thinking. So if you're with us and you're visiting tonight, you got a voucher, you'll get Dr. Nedley's book.
Hello, good evening. My name is Dr. Panaflek. I just had a quick question. When you mentioned television, shouldn't you also mention, for example, smartphones, iPad? Because I think they are having more of an influence right now than the television itself.
Yes, now I did mention entertainment screen time. And a lot of the times these smartphones are not used for very smart things. And they can be really entertainment boxes. And one of the concerns, one of the highest rising addictions in our society is called a techno addict. A techno addict would be in an engaging social environment, but instead he would rather be in a corner texting someone who is far less engaging than the people that are surrounding him. That's a sign of a techno addict, and a techno addict actually has been shown to have about the same type of frontal lobe function as a functioning alcoholic. And so it can be a significant detrimental effect. So it's really how we utilize our smartphones.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. These are excellent questions. It
Yes.
makes a whole difference in this world.
And our viewers are asking the question as far as children are concerned. You alluded to that they're unable to think three-dimensionally and to work and function appropriately. Would you comment on that, please?
Yes, absolutely. All of this two-dimensional work actually does limit our brain's ability. And particularly it's limiting architectural ability, and also materials type of ability. And these are things that we really need in our society today that are dropping off because of our two-dimensional environment that we're surrounding ourselves with.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question. You talked about the percentage size of the frontal lobe. And assuming there's optimal percentages of the size of different brain areas, is there a specific, since we don't all have the medical equipment, is there a specific set of tests or questions aside from the IQ tests that we can use to test the different areas and that help us understand if we improve or where we are?
Yes, that's a very good point. You know, the IQ test is measuring more than just frontal lobe function. It's also measuring some temporal lobe, some spatial orientation, so there's parietal lobe, occipital lobe there. But there are tests that have been developed precisely to measure more of one lobe than the other, and particularly more of the frontal lobe. And, but those tests involve taking a look particularly at judgment, critical thinking, rational thinking, and also in regards to our ability to have foresight. And if we limit it to those type of things, we can start isolating the frontal lobe more in regards to our testing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nedley. Katja has asked me now to be a neurosurgeon and to cut the mental health topic. So we won't have more questions tonight, unfortunately, but tomorrow night we will.
Yes.
And it remains for us to thank Dr. Nedley for a very comprehensive and